As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Egypt is building an 8-square-mile walled enclosure in the Sinai Desert near Gaza to prepare for an influx of Palestinian refugees as Israel is vowing to launch an assault on Rafah, the southern Gaza city that borders Egypt and is packed with about 1.5 million Palestinians. So the revelation of Egypt's construction, which was reported by the Wall Street Journal and an Egyptian rights group, signals that Cairo is caving to Israeli pressure to allow Palestinians to enter its territory. Egyptian officials told the Wall Street Journal that more than 100,000 people would be able to fit into the camp that they are constructing. If a mass exodus of Palestinians from Gaza does happen, the Egyptian official said that they want to limit the number of refugees they allow in to be between 50,000 and 60,000. I think if they start coming across the border, it would probably be pretty difficult for Egypt to limit the number. I mean, depending on how big the Israeli assault on Rafah is. So the Sinai Foundation for Human Rights first reported on the construction on Wednesday and said that the project is expected to be completed within 10 days. Egyptian officials told the Journal that they expect a broad Israeli offensive on Rafah to start within weeks. Israel definitely knows that Egypt is building this camp. And I'm sure that with that knowledge, that means they're going to try to push as many Palestinians as they can into that camp, into Egypt. That's really their ultimate goal here. Israeli government officials, ministers in the Netanyahu government have not been shy about their desire to expel the Palestinians from Gaza and reestablish Jewish settlements in the Strip. I always go back to that document that was leaked back in October when this thing first started, that was drawn up by the Israeli intelligence ministry. And it laid out potential scenarios for a post-war Gaza. And the best scenario, based on their assessment, was all of the Palestinians in Gaza, all 2.3 million of them, being kicked out into Egypt, and Israel creating a buffer zone in Egyptian territory so they couldn't get close to Gaza. And we've seen Netanyahu has said that he is looking for countries to absorb Palestinians. But since then, he's kind of cooled the rhetoric on that since the Biden administration has criticized Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, these Israeli ministers who speak very openly about this stuff. But still, it's very much what these Israeli officials want, is to kick these Palestinians out. And so the U.S. recently conducted a cyber attack against an alleged Iranian spy ship that has been operating near Djibouti. And this was reported by NBC News on Thursday. So one U.S. official identified the ship as the motor vessel Bashad, which is registered as a cargo ship in Iran. The U.S. claims that the ship is used to provide intelligence to the Houthis, while Iran's ambassador to the UN insisted last week that the vessel is in the Red Sea to combat piracy activities and is not involved in Houthi operations. The nature of the cyber attack on the Bashad is unclear. The U.S. official said that it was intended to disrupt the vessel's alleged intelligence operations. So the cyber attack occurred about a week ago and was part of the U.S. response to the drone attack that killed 3 members of the U.S. Army Reserve and wounded about 40 Arizona National Guardsmen at a secretive U.S. base in Jordan near the Syrian border. So that attack on Tower 22 that killed 3 U.S. troops also wounded 40 members of the National Guard. And, this is a secretive U.S. drone base that's used to support airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. Why isn't it just crazy that it's the National Guard that gets deployed there? That's why I've been pushing for people to get involved in the Defend the Guard stuff, because I think it has a lot of power. If they pass the legislation in a state, that means the federal government cannot deploy that state's National Guard to war zones where if Congress hasn't officially declared war, and they haven't done that since World War II. And that's who's deployed to Syria, Iraq, and this secretive base in Jordan. So I think it's really important. So this article is from the Cato Institute, from Patrick Eddington. And so the FISA thing, Section 702 of FISA, again, due to expire in April. And the House, some members of the House they're talking about putting up a bill that would require warrants for this type of surveillance under FISA. And Jake Sullivan was asked about how the administration stands on the extension of FISA, and basically he said that he could not say exactly because they haven't really put out an official statement on it. But he said, discussing the warrant requirement to access FISA data on Americans, he said that would not be in the national interest of the United States. When asked about warrants for surveillance of Americans, he said that's not in the national interest of the United States. And that's the National Security Advisor saying that. So it's very clear that the White House, if they do try to pass any sort of reform to FISA Section 702, they would probably veto it. And that's what Eddington says in this article about it. And I just thought it was an important story that I didn't see get much attention, and that's a point he makes here. So that's how the administration stands on this.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And here are some of today's trends in the news on the market front. Hey, the Dow went up today. Yeah, great news, huh? The Dow went up. You know why the Dow went up? Well, retail sales tumbled 0.8% in January, much more than expected. That's the way the headline is in CNBC. So they went up because it looks like the Fed now is not going to keep interest rates where they are. They may lower them because the economy is slowing down. And we said this was going to happen. And the numbers are rigged. They pump them up to make you feel good, so the markets go up because advanced retail sales declined 0.8% for the month, following a downwardly revised 0.4% gain in December. 0.4% gain in December. That's holiday spending. Things are supposed to boom back then, right? Yeah. So it's slowing down. There's absolutely no question about it. And what we have is dragflation. The economy's going down and inflation's still high. Because when you look at the real inflation numbers, people are suffering, the cost of automobiles, insurance, on and on and on, way up. Just to put into perspective, and again, this is adjusted for inflation. If you bought a car in today's inflation numbers in 1974, it would cost about $22,000. Today, it's nearly $50,000. All right? So it's a lot worse than they're making it. And again, we believe that this may well be the year of the crash because there are a lot of trends shaping the future that have very little to do with economics in their geopolitics. And geopolitics had nothing to do with economics because the people running countries in a country near you are out of their fucking minds. Little pieces of shit. Little pieces of, from Boris Johnson to Sunak, shit. Yeah. Take out the UN and put shit after it beginning with Sunak. Yeah. Little fucking boy dresses up and goes to Ukraine. He got his, his dungarees on, looking tough. Little fucking Catson Macron with a fucking Rothschild pecker about that big with his fake fucking hair running France. Out of his mind, fucking Biden. One shit show after another. This could be the year of the crash because the biggest thing threatening the markets are the maniacs in charge that are threatening life on Earth. And we'll get to that as well. Netanyahu being one of them. So here we go. The futures markets, by the way, say they're going to start lowering rates in June. We say it's going to be earlier. Amount of commercial real estate loans due this year spike, nearly $1 trillion. Again, one of our top trends for 2024 is office building bust. This thing's going to go down big. They're barely talking about it. And of course, it's going to be brought down because of the office building bust. You have an office vacancy rate of about 20%, and it's global. Here we go. New York Community, again. Delinquency rates on commercial mortgage-backed securities are expected to rise to over 8% in 2024. And that's according to Fitch. So you can see what's going to happen here. And again, we're reporting week after week, which they barely report in the mainstream media. The bank shares are going in the toilet as the equity markets are going up because they're being driven up by the tech stocks. Nearly 20% of outstanding debt on U.S. commercial and multifamily real estate will mature, right, this year. So you're going to start seeing a lot of defaults as they mature because they have to, they're interest loans. So now they're revolving loans. So now interest rates are way up here compared to when they got these, when they were way down there. So now they have less money coming in, less tenants, high debt load. You're going to see defaults and banks go bust. The Wall Street Journal. EV revolution gets a reality check. No shit. One of your top trends for 2024? EVFU. We've been warning about this for a long time. We said this was going to happen. It's now happening. And again, the cost is one thing. The efficiency is another thing. And again, people are suffering. 63% of people living paycheck to paycheck. This week is the 71st week we've been putting in job cuts around the world. This thing is going down big. Your markets are going up. They're cutting back wages, trying to save as much money as they can. And again, now what's going to happen when all these people are out of work? How are you going to pay your mortgages? How are you going to pay your loans on your cars? Oh, by the way, talking about the loans on the cars and everything else that's going on, delinquency rates. Let's see over here. Already in the fourth quarter of last year, 7.7% of auto loans transitioned to delinquency.
And of course, the subject is Julian Assange, the founder and former operator of WikiLeaks, who is in prison in Britain right now. And the question is, will he be extradited to the United States to face espionage charges? And so, first of all, I believe the news is his hearing is coming up later this month. Is that correct? And this is the very last shot at the entire appeals process in the UK, Kevin?
Yeah, on February 20th and 21st of next week, we have a 2-day hearing in which Assange and his team will have their first chance to basically lay out some appeal arguments. They're asking the British High Court of Justice, an appeals court, to overturn the lower court's decision, which was passed on to the UK government 1.5 years ago. And the British government already authorized his extradition to the United States. And that's what they're appealing.
Right. Okay, so exactly at issue in this case is not just Julian Assange and the U.S. government's vendetta against him, but there's apparently a huge consensus finally now at this late date, but coming together now among major news organizations and human rights groups, et cetera, that free speech itself in the West, in the United States, is in jeopardy. Now, is that just a bunch of hyperbole? Because after all, we're talking about a guy that people love to hate. Maybe they'll just get him.
No, we finally got quite a number of groups standing on principle. As I speak to you in the last 24 hours, we saw a letter put out by over 35 law professors that the Freedom of the Press Foundation put together to send to Attorney General Merrick Garland to make their position known that this would mean that in the future, any presidential administration could charge journalists with a felony. Because when you're charged with an Espionage Act offense, you're facing a felony conviction potentially. So, this is a big deal. This is a big deal going forward. We're seeing people stand up. And also in Australia, I should note that in the last day or two, we saw a vote in their parliament that basically took a stand and said, we oppose the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. And the Australian government is an ally, a close ally of the United States.
Right. Yeah, it's about time that they finally stood up, but they have been for the last year or so, right? So does it look like that's having any kind of effect? Or
there's been a lot of consternation on the part of Assange supporters in Australia because they feel that the prime minister and other officials who have power to pressure Biden won't do it. And there's a lot of foreign policy reasons, I think, for why they're very careful about how far they go. So they're doing the bare minimum, but it's more than we can say about anybody in the U.S. government. And they're really doing a poor job. It's extremely disappointing that there's a resolution in the House right now that was put forward to say that if you believe in principles of freedom of the press, then you need to support an end to this case against Julian Assange. And there's only like 10 representatives out of 435 that have put their name to it. It's awful.
Okay, can you give us a little bit of a 101 here about why it is that Genocide Joe is going after this guy so bad here?
I don't know why Joe's so intent to put him on trial, but Assange was indicted, for the liberal listeners, by President Donald Trump. So it's been said to try and get some of the Democrats on his side that if you oppose Donald Trump, then you have to oppose the indictment of Julian Assange. All right, so we will play partisan politics for a moment there.
Sure.
Now, principally, what we're looking at here is the fact that the U.S. government is saying they can enforce a secrecy law against people who aren't even from this country. Julian Assange is an Australian citizen. Why should he have to, one, pledge allegiance to the United States, but also why should he have to worry about any of the U.S. government's national security interests? And why should anybody have to follow these laws? Again, to your liberal listeners, they wouldn't accept this from the Russian government, from Vladimir Putin. And in fact, we have a very similar case playing out right now where Evan Gershkovich, a Wall Street Journal reporter, is being kept in detention. And Tucker Carlson, who I know your liberal listeners, if they're here listening, they hate him, but he did ask at the end of a 2-hour interview 3 times, when are you going to release Evan Gershkovich from detention? And Putin maintains that Gershkovich was going around collecting state secrets and was engaged in espionage. Well, collecting secrets is journalism, and Julian Assange was engaged in journalism. So if Gershkovich should be freed, then Assange should be freed as well.
Can you tell us real quickly, is it true, as in your headline here, that the CIA plotted to kidnap and murder Julian Assange, Kevin?
It's true if you believe over 30 sources that these 3 reporters, Michael Isikoff, Sean Naylor, and Zach Dorfman, they worked on this and they talked to these Trump administration officials and intelligence officials, some I think with links to the CIA, and found that Mike Pompeo, as CIA director, was putting together sketches of plans to kill or poison or rendition Julian Assange to the United States. It got the Justice Department in a panic, and ultimately, I believe that's why he was charged when he was charged, because they were afraid he was going to arrive in the U.S. and they were going to be caught with their pants down with no indictment against him.
All right, well, I don't know. Is there anything anybody can do? Hop on a plane, go to England and protest outside next week, or what's going on here?
Yeah, so you can go there if you want and protest. You can also be prepared for what looks like an inevitability to be there in D.C. if he is brought to Alexandria, Virginia, and put on trial. I mean, it's going to be important to take a stand against this unprecedented attack on journalism.
The last clip that we ran, I don't know if you caught this at the beginning. I'm sure you did. The reporter says, "Is there any way to get that money without waiting for Congress?" And Biden said no. Well, they did that with Israel. They sent Israel $200 million by certifying on a weekend when Congress wasn't meeting that this was, and Congress still hasn't ratified it, that this was a matter of American national security. I contend that that's an act of perjury, because it's not a matter of national security. And Secretary Blinken had to sign under oath that it was. The statute requires that he sign under oath that it is. You're probably familiar with this from your years.
Yes, very familiar with it.
Right. Yeah. In order to get in the Treasury to loosen the cash or the DOD to send equipment over there. I would defy the secretary to explain how it's a matter of national security.
Of all the picayunish things we've done in the past 30 years to bring articles of impeachment to bear against people, particularly presidents, there hasn't been a single one of those things that probably would have been in the founder's eyes an impeachable offense. This is. There is no question about it. In the founder's eyes, particularly James Madison, this would be an impeachable offense for both the Secretary of State and the president. So that's how grave this offense is, in my view, and in the view of this republic, if there's anybody out there that cares about it being a democratic federal republic anymore.
I want to underscore what you just said, and I'm happy that Madison, who of course is the scrivener of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention, you know this, you teach this at William and Mary. The Constitution expressly says no money shall be spent from the Treasury, but what is expressly authorized by Congress and put in a public journal. Oh, okay, Tony Blinken, you just spent $200 million that wasn't approved by Congress and wasn't put in a public journal, and you lied under oath in order to do it. Is he going to be impeached for that? Absolutely not. Well, are you able to put a numerical handle on the Ukraine war? Could you tell us what it costs roughly per week, per day, per month, however you want to break it down, for the Ukraine military to attempt to resist the Russians?
I've seen a wide range of figures, just as I've seen a wide range of figures for the war in Gaza right now. I've seen everything from 75 million to 150 million a day. I tend to come down in the middle of that, maybe 100 million a day.
How about Gaza? What is the IDF spending? We know where they're getting the cash and the equipment from the U.S., but what do you think they're spending a day?
When they conducted Operation Cast Lead for about 23 days, as I recall, and did the same thing and gave us a precursor of this, murdered everything in sight, it was about 100 to 125 million a day. I suspect it's close to that today. And you don't really have a way of calculating it precisely because, as you said, there's so much U.S. money that's very fungible in there. Right. There's so many assets that are fungible, like drawing down our war reserve stocks. No one puts a price tag on that until 10 years from now when they have to replenish them.
If the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, were to call you up and ask you to tell him why he should not put on the floor of the House or do everything in his power to prevent the ratification or the approval of the Senate version of this, of aid to Ukraine, what would you tell him?
I would tell him that on his back and on his heart and in his mind must be the deaths of every Ukrainian who passes now once this money has been approved, because it's lost. And all you're doing is, in the old farmer's terms, you're pounding sand down a rat hole. You are making sure that more Ukrainians will die for nothing.
How depleted is the Ukrainian getting back to sending gear over there? How depleted is the Ukrainian military? Do they even have the technical capability to operate whatever we have in storage that we might be able to get there in the next 6 or 12 months? And you can expand on this, Colonel. Will there be a Ukraine military under the command of President Zelensky and General Sarsky in 6 or 8 months?
Well, that's a very good question. Not one that's cohesive and capable of maintaining a reasonable battlefield sobriety and success rate. It will be at best fighting last-ditch delaying tactics against a Russian juggernaut that is in no special hurry to do anything further than what they've done. The only place I worry about with that regard, and I've said this elsewhere, is if I were the Russian military, and I have a lot of respect for some of the mid-rank of the Russian military, which now has risen a little. The cream rises to the top, especially in war. They would be salivating over the prospects of closing this out with Odessa, because Odessa is a far more important port than Sevastopol or anything else along that coastline. And if they had Odessa, that would sort of cement their fears of the Black Sea problem and the threat from the south in that arena. So, as Clausewitz says, the dynamics of war change with every day of battle. And you start getting to the point where Ukraine is feeble and can't really do much of anything, no matter what NATO does, short of putting NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine. And maybe that might whet the appetite, and the military might persuade Putin that they need Odessa. So they're going to lose even more, and they're going to lose the most valuable port in the country.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Talking point from pro-Trump people about foreign policy, as I'm sure you've heard a bunch of times, Rob, is no new wars. He didn't get us into any new stupid wars like George W. Bush did and Barack Obama did. But hey, Donald Trump did not start another disastrous war. And okay, whatever, we could get into the merits of that claim. He certainly continued a lot of them, and he flirted with a couple of other wars that we almost got into, but like in Iran and Venezuela. But regardless of that, it's really amazing for someone my age that that's the talking point. I don't really hear, it's not like their talking point is like, he wasn't a softie like Obama and he really took the gloves off and killed ISIS. Which could just as easily be their talking point, but it's not. And their talking point is like, hey, he didn't get us into another stupid war. So I at least appreciate that. At least that's the right mindset to have. Anyway, obviously, since October 7th, there's been, it's almost like an earthquake that split the land and divided the right half of America into these two different camps. And there's one camp that kind of got teleported back to 2003. And then there's the other camp who's like, oh no, we really meant it. And there's probably no better representatives of those two camps than Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson. Debatably, the two most influential conservative commentators who have just completely split on this issue. And that's just, to me, it's really fascinating to see. I understand where it's a little bit disheartening for people who are like non-interventionist types like us, that so many of the Republicans, went back to supporting foreign wars. But I will say, I kind of look at it as an opportunity, like, it's like the, when the grass is cut, the snakes are shown or something like that. I forget how the saying goes, but it's something about that. Like in these moments, it's revealing. You see who's who, and that's kind of good to know, Any thoughts on any of it, Rob?
Beware of the snakes in the grass. I never heard of that expression before.
I may have just made it up. I don't know. It's something like that.
I think it works.
The point is, if you cut the grass, then you can see where the snakes are. But if the grass is real high, there might be snakes down there and you don't even know about it. I always have these suspicions, I remember talking about this with you over the years where I'm like, yeah, man, if there was like a big terrorist attack or something, most of these Republicans who are talking about being non-interventionists now would just support blindly whatever the next war is. I didn't realize the terrorist attack didn't have to occur on Americans. I thought it would probably have to happen here. But it seems like it happening in Israel might have been even more traumatizing.
The likelihood of a terrorist attack happening inside of the United States and it not have been the result of us not having any border security has to be close to zero. So I'm just saying, if there is a terrorist attack at some juncture in time,
I wouldn't put it near zero. I think there's a strong possibility that it could come from the fact that we have wide open borders. But look, there are a lot of Muslims in America, and many of them do get radicalized by our foreign policy, a mix of the FBI and our foreign policy. Yes, it's almost always both of those, to be honest.
It's like, let's go with not even a friend, your brother. You're out with your brother and he keeps getting drunk and picking fights at bars. You go, buddy, you have to quit picking fights at bars because you're going to get me into a fight. And this is really stupid. We're stuck with the United States government. We're going, quit provoking people. Why are we picking these fights? You might get us into a war. That is a very real risk. And it's a very logical thing to look at this situation and go, why are you trying to get us into these fights? You're just going to lead to death for no reason. There's no upside here. Look at the last couple wars. Was there an upside? Did we win them? Did we walk away with any tangible victories, or just a lot of death and a lot of money spent?
And a far better armed Taliban. We're looking for what we actually accomplished. Yeah, no, I mean, it's right. That's a great analogy, and it's as insane as being against that, and as insane as being like, as your brother is getting drunk and picking fights, and you're like, dude, what are you doing? First off, it's wrong that you just assaulted that guy. Second of all, you're risking that you're going to get beat up, and you're risking that I'm going to have to get involved, man, because you're my brother, and now I'm going to have to fight with you in the bar fight. And then Dave Rubin comes along and goes, guys, we got to stop arguing about this, because to new people who are just discovering this family, now it seems like we're all divided.
Yeah, I want to be grouped in with you warmongers.
Yeah, we're divided, but we're divided over this thing. And this thing is wrong. And my brother needs to stop picking bar fights. And then if he goes like, well, listen, what if I could just assure you that you're not going to be drawn into the bar fight? Then can we brush this aside and we can all go back to just watching your brother pick bar fights for no reason?
Because he's still being a jerk off.
Yeah, like, no, that's not, no. Then in fact, like I was saying earlier, and this is kind of why I let in like this, like, I don't know. Like, look, obviously, I'm a libertarian. So I'm never in anybody's team, really. You know, I'm always out here and I'm always just on the team that doesn't win. That's our role in life. But like I said, like, whatever, how about, like, and this is what I was saying about RFK at the beginning. It's like, how about, no, you're not on my team if we disagree on this issue. Then that's it. It's like, I don't know what else, there's just nothing from any perspective that's reasonable. Whether you could be a left-winger, a right-winger, a libertarian, whatever. War is the most serious thing. It's the most important policy. It's the most evil thing that governments do. It's it's like, if you're against government programs, well, let me tell you about the worst government program there is. It's war. That's for libertarians. If you're a leftist and you're against like power imbalances or vulnerable people being exploited, well, let me tell you the worst version of that, the worst case of that. It's called war. If you're a fiscal conservative, you know what I mean? Like, any angle you come at it from, it goes, well, this is the worst thing. This is the worst thing in the world. And I'm sorry, if we're divided on the most important issue, then we're not on the same team. And I don't even care. You could be good on a lot of other issues, but like, no, we're still not on the same team if you're bad on the mass murder issue.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
In the 21st century, there have been 3 episodes, more than any other episodes, where I've heard people say, well, at a moment like this, nobody can be a libertarian. Or this is a terrible time to be a libertarian. So COVID was one. Can't be a libertarian during a pandemic, Mary. Second, the 2008 financial crisis. You remember George W. Bush, I have to abandon free market principles to save the free market system. We heard him say that. And then the third was 9/11. Well, you can't be a libertarian on 9/11 because, you see, if you're a libertarian, this sort of thing happens and we have to go, kick some asses out there, all that. And yet, once the dust settled and our wits returned, you realize that actually, if you'd been a libertarian in all 3 cases, things would have turned out much better in each case.
Yes. Well, this, Tom, goes back to what happened to when the U.S. started shifting from a very free country. And I realized there were exceptions to this. So, like, it wasn't universal. There were some classes, such as, maybe women and people of color, that didn't have total freedom. But in the early 1900s, something changed in the way we regarded freedom. So the elites started saying things like, well, freedom is a great thing, but it really doesn't help the poor. It really doesn't keep the environment clean. And so what they did is they made the argument that liberty wasn't practical, and people bought into that. And of course, liberty, as you just gave the best example for, is exactly what is most practical. So I think we may be coming back to that, because now we're seeing an extreme, as we did in all the 3 areas that you mentioned. We saw how bad things got when we gave up our liberty to make things better. It didn't make things better, it made them worse.
So let's talk now about, so one of the things you're good at is, and I think this comes through in your book, by the way, which I'll link to. Is it still easy to get?
Yes, Healing Our World, I think, is what you're referring to. And
yes.
Actually, in the project we're going to talk about in a little bit, people can find out how they can get a digital copy free.
Oh, well, that's even better. That's even better.
Because I thought you might like that.
What we need is are people who are able to give pithy, yes, but substantive pithy answers to the kinds of objections people might have. One of your strengths is that you're good at that. Somebody asks a question, well, I don't see how this would work. And you're very good at giving those pithy responses. And by the way, another part of this is pointing out to people that very often they're comparing not the real world with libertarianism. They're comparing a utopia with libertarianism. And we have to say, the schools right now, like in this day and age, are terrible. And everybody knows it. But for some reason, when you ask me about education, we're acting like it's great now. And everybody in the inner city is getting a fantastic education. But if you came along, it would be worse. I don't see how.
Exactly. Well, and of course, people have lost track of what freedom means. When I went into the classroom in the 80s and early 90s, I would, in the beginning, say things like, well, we all know how inefficient the government is. And everybody would nod their heads in agreement. And I was going to political science classes or economics classes in the colleges, things like that. But towards the end of the 10 years that I did this, when I would say something like that the government was less efficient than the private sector, the teacher would argue with me. And there's been a cultural shift in what people know. And that's why generally when I went into the classroom, I always started with having the students vote on what their ideal system would be, and then what our government currently does. And this is a very effective thing for anybody who goes into the classroom. I'd put on the board, the minority should rule the majority, number 1. The majority should rule the minority, number 2. And 3, everyone should rule themselves as long as they don't initiate physical force, fraud, or theft against others. So I asked the students to vote. If you got to decide how the world would work, the political world, what would you vote on? And about 90 to 95% of the students raised their hands for the non-aggression principle, the third item, which is the basis of libertarianism. And then I would ask them, how do you feel that the current U.S. government fits into one of these 3 categories? And almost no one would raise their hand for the third one, the libertarian one. They would be either saying the minority should rule the majority or the majority should rule the minority. So right away, you establish rapport because people naturally gravitate to the non-aggression principle. And then, of course, where you get all tripped up usually is explaining how that translates to the real world.
Yeah.
That taxation is theft. That regulation actually has the opposite effect of it doesn't protect us. It actually turns us over to those who would exploit us. And of course, there's where, but that's why it's important to get that agreement up front if you can. And if you're just talking to friends and family, it's just important, I think, to establish a similar rapport. So if they say, if they're very negative, for example, and might say, well, in a libertarian world, people would starve in the streets. You need to be able to come back with something that will get them to ask you more. And so one of the things I like to do in that case, I like to say, well, of course, we all want to live in a world where people don't starve in the streets, but the poor would have more in a libertarian society. And they go, what? No. And so they say, how do you figure that? And then you have an opportunity to speak and, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes because they want to know how that would work. You've got their interest piqued. And you also establish rapport with them by acknowledging the fact that you recognize that what they want is a better world. And of course, so do we. So there's things like that that can really help us when we're trying to share the message.
I'm sure many people wonder, this isn't very complex. We put up that chart and explain what's happening. This isn't some algebraic equation that we're explaining. This is very simple to understand. Is it possible that the government doesn't know what they're doing, that the Fed doesn't know what they're doing? Now, there are many that really don't know. They have no economic sense whatsoever. But there are those that do understand what they're doing, and they have their own motives. Dr. Paul mentions often on our show how there are people that create chaos because that's where they believe they will thrive. Lenin said that the best way to destroy a capitalist society is to just keep printing the money, destroy the money, and you'll destroy the capitalist society. And he's right. He was right, and so there are those people today who thrive and want to create chaos. They want to create the destruction of the dollar, increases in crime, shoplifting. Now, why would they want that? Well, they believe that they could use that to their advantage. If you want, let's say, a strong man to come in and say, I'm going to bring back law and order. Now, normally, many people will not want a strong man. They will absolutely be against it. But when crime is going through the roof, When the dollar is worth less, when people are fighting over bread, they'll be more susceptible to, yes, bring in this law and order person and he'll straighten things out. This is what happened in Germany. Hitler arrived after hyperinflation. It's not to say that that's what's in our future, but we should keep it in mind that that's, what those people that lust after that power, what they are looking for to capitalize. So it's a very bad situation not to understand money. More and more people do understand it, thanks to Dr. Paul and what he has done, but we still have a long way to go.
Very good. The inflation is the printing of a lot of money. Goods and services don't accommodate, and so more money chasing these goods. That's the simplistic explanation, but that's basically it. It's a monetary problem, and then they always have this patch up works, wage and price controls, and then here comes a consequence that is illegal. It makes it more illegal. No, this is the shoplifting. Well, in a way, I guess if you can get away with it, that's sort of going to help your situation for a while, but it won't last because you have to have production, and that doesn't produce anything. That takes away from the production, and it's an illusion if people think that helps, because people will say, well, I'm going to get it like right recently. I think the Social Security sent out $1,600 more per check for anybody who asks, and for a week or two that goes, but it just makes prices go up. And guess who suffers the most? It's the poor people, the middle class people. The wealthy don't have to pay that tax. It's always the poor people, and but the poor people in the middle class get bamboozled into it, accepting it. Well, I need help, so do this, give me this program and that program, and we need more money for schools and this sort of thing, and they go along with it. But on the long run, it doesn't solve the problem, because the poor do get poorer and the rich get richer under these circumstances. They have more billionaires now than ever before. There's more financial bubbles around the world than ever before, and it has to do with the massive monetary inflation that's been going on for the last 10 and 15 years, and it looks like to sustain it, they have to keep increasing it. Without the Fed, you would not have this outlandish, steady growth of big government and inflation, and shoplifting will not solve that problem.
Very good, Dr. Paul. I will finish up by taking a broader view on a big lesson that all of us are going to have to learn at some point, and that's that power must be kept locally. The reason being because you know who you're dealing with locally. There's recourse locally when people get out of hand. The further you get away, the less recourse you have. I mean, do you feel like you have any control over what happens in Washington, D.C.? I know I don't. Or the Federal Reserve? Absolutely not. They don't really care what I think, and that's it. And that also puts in their minds, hey, there's no recourse. We can do whatever we want. And they have that attitude. And the further you get away, now let's go on the global scale. There's these goofy globalists that want world government. And look what happened with the World Health Organization during COVID. It was all nonsense and lies on a global scale, because there's no recourse. If there's a world government in Brussels, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. So that's why they want world government. They want no recourse from anybody. But when you're talking about local, you may know your mayor. I know my mayor goes to my gym. He's responsible, and the people are right there. So that's what you need. And the reason we also need that is because men are not angels. We are susceptible to greed, to envy, to all the bad sins, to use religious terms. So you can't have unlimited power. You need to be kept in check. So we need a big lesson in going from all these global Federal Reserves, all this nonsense, back down to real local government.
Very good. And that's what people don't understand, and they don't want to, because they still believe that the world would fall apart if you didn't have socialist, fascist type of economies where the government would pass out the goods and make it all fair and equal. It's failing now, and it's going to continue to fail. That's why I advise people, a good way to start it, if you want to go back in the other direction, take a look at the Constitution. The Constitution is pretty good on this, on what kind of government we're supposed to have. But right now, there's still people begging and pleading and demanding from government. But also, we see more and more people joining us and saying, this is absolutely right. Limited government. We should have a system where merit and a meritocracy, that's when people get promoted by what they can do and what they can offer, and not what the government decides that you can do, and artificially, line up all the redistribution, which is artificial and unfair. People will say, well, it's such a mess. What could we do? Well, it's such a mess, it's going to get worse. Maybe you could slow it down, and maybe there will be a chance to change it. You have to change people's mind. So it's a matter of changing people's mind that makes the difference, and that's where I'm an optimist. I do believe that if people are fully informed, they will finally realize that freedom is so much better than authoritarianism. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.